And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to welcome back to the show Taylor Adams. Taylor has a phenomenal new book. It's called Her Last Breath, released a couple of days ago. There it is. There it is. I have a copy here somewhere, and I was looking for it right before we went live. And I have three daughters who love thrillers, and they will drift into my office, and books that I am currently reading or prepping for a show will just disappear. So I'm not naming names, but anyway. So Taylor, how's it going, buddy?
Oh, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well, doing well. If memory serves, this is our fourth show that we've done. The first time we chatted, I think it was like 7 years ago.
I think so.
When your first book came out, No Exit.
Yeah, that was way back.
Yeah, I think it was like 7 years ago. But No Exit, just to kind of bring people up to speed, has had an interesting life from the little book that could.
Yeah, I like that.
Kind of went on to to do great and mighty things. That book became a movie.
Yes, it did on Hulu, or I think it might be Disney Plus now. Hulu and Disney Plus are kind of
it's one of the same. Yeah, we get to Hulu through Disney Plus, but I think you can technically get them separately. But who knows?
Might as well just get them all at once.
The streaming world has become the wild, wild west.
Yeah, we have a 3-year-old, so we need Disney Plus. So we've always got Disney Plus.
Oh yes. So how do you feel about that? From the kind of breakout book that becomes a movie. I mean, that's kind of every author's dream, at least somewhere along. Everyone wants to write books, but seeing your book become a movie, I mean, come on. If you're like me, you grew up watching movies, nerding out about that's just got to be kind of the pinnacle.
It is amazing. I still pinch myself. I still kind of like remind myself, oh wow, that actually happened, and I could go on Hulu right now and watch it. And another thing, like, I'm so grateful that it happened. I'm also really grateful that they came out with, I think, a pretty darn fun movie. And I know that's not always, like, adaptations are really hard, and I've seen lots of book to screen adaptations that have been fumbled, even with really good intentions. It's a really hard process. So A, it's just a blessing that it happened, because it's been amazing for my career. And then B, it's also a blessing that, like, hey, it's a pretty fun movie. Like, I love the soundtrack of that movie. I listen to that soundtrack while I write, which is a weird way for things to come full circle.
If that's not the most meta thing ever. That's so fun. Yeah, which I really had no intention of talking about this, but while we're on the subject, what does that do for your confidence as a writer? That once you've had a book, it was successful, other people liked it, decided that they would like to make a motion picture out of it. The blank page is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. Everybody sits down to a blank page at the beginning of a new book. That's past accolades don't mean anything, when you're starting a new book. But, it's nice to have some extra tools in your toolkit when you sit down.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like every book I write, I learn things from. And so I've got like more tools in the toolkit. But I mean, it really hasn't changed my confidence at all, because I'm always completely terrified. Every time I start a book, I'm terrified it's not going to work. By the time I finish,
you should, I think.
Yeah. There's always terror throughout the whole process. And, when I'm releasing a book, I'm terrified that people are going to hate it. I don't I don't feel any more confident than I did 10 years ago at writing. But I do think that, like, that terror is helpful, because it makes me work really hard. Right. And I felt like if I felt like I was just cruising, I feel like maybe I would get sloppy. But because I'm terrified, every morning when I wake up, I work really, really hard.
It's like dancing on the edge of a razor, this is like, God, I've got to make this thing happen. But I talk a lot about the one of the most trite things that an interviewer could ever ask someone is, where do you get your ideas from? Because like we know that ideas are everywhere, that literally everywhere. And it's but there's something about those ideas that float a little higher than the others, or the ones that just feel like they have legs, or there's a character that walks onto the stage of your mind and they're just really intriguing, and you're like, I think there's something here. Like has that process changed for you, over the course of 4 books? The kind of and I'm not saying like where you dig your ideas up from, but the kind of that process of seeing something and the what if game starts playing and you're like, oh, okay, I think there's something here, or kind of losing interest with an idea. Does that get better?
This one might actually be the first time, because with my other books, they always kind of started with like a what if, like kind of a
Yeah.
pitch premise, like what if this happened at a rest stop or what have you. But this one really came about when I went down like a YouTube rabbit hole one day watching videos filmed by cavers, as they wriggle through these
Right.
really tight crawl spaces, and that really stuck with me. I don't remember when that was, but I'd been to caves before, and somehow it just kind of like got more and more momentum in my mind, like this is a genuinely cool setting for a novel. And like I didn't have a story. And I remember the first time I pitched this book to my editor, which was 2 years ago now, the story was completely different. But like we both agreed that the setting was really strong, and that like we needed to find something else, that the setting would really serve. And so yeah, it was really like all about the setting for this one. There wasn't the what if until much later, until we decided like, okay, best friends, that's an interesting dynamic. A bit of a murder mystery, that's a fun thing to kind of layer in there. But it all just started with, man, caves are scary. Caves have so many ways they can kill you. There's there's so many phobias I can work with. Like this is, as a thriller author, it's like, yes, I can get to work on this.
Yeah. Well, as a thriller author, I feel like that by nature, those books need to be very character driven, because you need to really feel the stakes personally. And you do that through characters that the reader quickly comes to love, or comes to hate. Sometimes there's a strong, it just needs to be a strong emotion either way. I think generally you want the reader to love your character, and then you start torturing your character. Although horrible characters can sell, it just takes a little more work. But it's very interesting that you started with a setting. How do you take the setting and then figure out a way to then build that character dynamic, that connection with the reader that you're going to have if you're going to tell this kind of story?
Well, the interesting thing about this one, in addition to the setting, was it's structured in a way, because there's multiple points of view, that I'm very careful with like what we know about each character at each time.
Right.
And so I'm if I've done my job right, you're feeling sympathetic for a certain character at a certain time, and then later you're not feeling sympathetic for them. It's all kind of about like pacing out what you know and when you know it. And that was a really fun. It's a fun structure to play with, because typically, my books are normally they just follow one character, and this one's kind of unique, where it's one part is one character, one part is another character who is probably like one of the worst humans imaginable, and then everybody's kind of the protagonist of their own section of the story, which it's interesting. It's also, from like a keeping the story's momentum standpoint, it's also really tricky, because it can be really disorienting if you're in one person's head and then suddenly you're going to spend the next 100 pages in somebody else's head, and you don't even like this person. This is a bad person, but you're interested in what they're doing here.
Yeah, and then trying to figure out what that character's motivation is, because you can have a really horrible character, but if the reader understands their motivation, kind of where they're coming from, because everyone is the protagonist in their own story. Now, how do you bring them out of their own story and put into 100 pages of a book? That's really when did kind of you had the setting, then you start thinking of characters. Like, when did they come in, and how did you figure out how to uh weave them in so that we have an actual story in this great setting?
Yeah, well, it all kind of came down to, I mean, the starting point was we both agreed that best friends was a really interesting dynamic. Originally, it
Yeah.
was like an engaged couple, but for going on an adventure and then all of kind of the emotional baggage that comes between
Right.
people, best friends since school, since childhood was a really interesting kind of route to explore. And then from there, we've got one character who's very adventurous, very confident, very self-made, loves caving. And then we've got another character who's always kind of existed in this person's shadow, in her best friend's shadow, and honestly doesn't want to be in a cave. This is the first time she's ever agreed to do this with her friend. She'd rather be at home reading a book. But that created a really interesting dynamic and an interesting kind of friction because, we have these situations that gradually escalate, and the adventurous, confident friend make some decisions that are gonna, like, you've got a bad feeling about this, and
Right.
we're rooted then with the more shy friend who's having doubts. But everybody's kind of the underdog at different points.
Right. What were some of the drawbacks to having a romantic relationship there? Because that's intriguing, because that sort of relationship brings a tension all its own, and and sort of a character back and forth that you can only get in that kind of relationship. But what were some of the detriments that you foresaw if having been that sort of relationship?
I think the main detriment that we both saw was it just felt like it had been done before, and I felt like it felt overfamiliar, and I felt like I wasn't able to get. I mean, it could certainly work if another
Yeah.
writer wrote it, but I wasn't the person to find something new enough in there for that to support the whole story, and it was even starting to feel like books that I'd written before, and I remember like agreeing, okay, this requires a different way in, a different entry point, different set of characters, and a different set of drama.
Yeah. Well, and the romantic relationship brings stakes of its own. But you sort of I could see that the reader would start expecting certain things to happen, because if it's a true romantic relationship, then things kind of have to work out a certain way, unless you're just going to blow the relationship up, by the end, which is totally possible.
Maybe I was gonna.
Yeah, maybe it's good. So, yeah, I could see where that would have limits, shall
Yeah.
we say? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And so the best friends, like that, just, and then kind of opening it up to the framing device and making it more of a mystery. Like these were all things that, like, I remember I was really excited about this book, and my editor told me, like, okay, if you can pull this off, it'll be really cool. And I remember, like, I was always in the back of my mind, I was thinking, okay, if you can pull this off, like, I hope I can pull this off.
So you're kind of known for your contained thrillers. There's you love to take these characters, put them in a confined space, where there's just not a lot of options, whether it's a cave, whether it's on a highway. The you kind of squeeze the characters, and in that squeeze comes all sorts of other tension. Is this is it a hallmark of your writing, to the point that, and what I mean by that is, when you sit down to start thinking about the new book, is that one of the tools in your toolbox, that you're going to employ? Well, this is going to happen, but I know I have to really kind of squeeze them with this sort of tension. Like, is that something you do on purpose, or is it just the way Taylor thinks?
I think part of it, at least part of it, is the way I think, because I'm always looking for ways to kind of apply pressure to the story itself, to the stakes of the story. And lots of times that's like, a really strict time limit, or I mean, in this instance, it's actual, like, physical rocks.
Yeah,
pressure.
literally.
Literally pressure.
Squeezing them. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe this is like the most extreme version of that, of a locked room thriller that I've done yet. But yeah, I've always loved what, like, a confined setting can do, or like a bottle episode, to use kind of a TV term. I love what that can do for your characters. I don't want to, like, overdo it, and I definitely, I'm trying to kind of find new ways to apply what I've learned without, like, repeating myself too much, because I can't just write every book at a rest stop or a cave. Like, I've got to do other stuff too.
What if it's a cave just off of a rest stop?
There we go. There we go.
You know?
That's new enough. I could squeeze one book out of that.
Right, literally, you could squeeze one book out of that. What does the confined space and what does that bring to the story? That if you just have an open world thriller where the characters literally could make any choice, go anywhere, remove themselves from the situation, what does that add to the story that that enhances and ramps up the tension and adds to like what does that do for you as the writer when you know they have nowhere to go?
I think the biggest thing is it forces the character to fend for him or herself. And there's no option to call the police. There's no option to phone a friend. You can't go, down the street to the store to buy something you might need to solve this problem. Like everything you have, all you have to solve this problem are whatever you might have been traveling with, whatever's in the trunk of your car, and you have to be incredibly self-sufficient. And I love what that does for a story. And I love seeing people have to kind of improvise with what they have without being able to, like, say, call the police or, do the things that a normal person normally has access to in a dangerous situation.
I think in a lot of the same way, there are more and more thriller mystery writers who are kind of turning back the clock and going back to like the 80s or early 90s where cell phones were not in everyone's pocket, and the solution to a whole lot of problems is just call for help. But when you take that away, then story can develop instead of just the easy out. And so yeah, I can see the allure of that for the same reason that other people are, well, let's not tell this in 2026 because there's a whole lot more we can do by stripping away all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a smart way to, often one of the first questions I have to ask is, okay, why can nobody call the police? And, it being the 80s or 90s, it's a great way to solve that problem.
Right. Exactly. So you said that you sort of pitched this idea to your editor like 2 years ago. What's the life cycle of the book development for you at this? And I know that, the publishing process, this book might've been off your desk a year ago, and when it starts going through all that, what's the typical life cycle like for you?
So it usually starts with a couple months of outlining, and that's usually when the story is in its really basic form, and I'm just kind of mushing ideas together and seeing, like, I like this character, I like this setting, and getting kind of the shape of the story. And this is where my editor is a huge help because we can kind of bounce ideas off of each other. Mm-hmm. And after usually takes a few months, it can sometimes take a while. Eventually, like, we'll have a solid enough outline of a story that she'll basically say, okay, go for it, start writing. And then I'll usually spend about maybe a year writing drafts, and I'll usually do like a first draft really fast because I try to get it all on paper as fast as I can. And I really believe that you have to write it badly quite a few times before you can start writing it goodly. I rewrite like an insane person, and I really enjoy the rewrite process because I find it really enjoyable to keep kind of refining the story and picking out what doesn't work and adding things that do work and just kind of texturing it and making it richer. But that whole part of the process takes probably about a year. And then, so I finished that with Her Last Breath around this time last year. And then, then there was, probably, I'd guess about 6 months of editing. And the editing was nothing too challenging. It was mostly just like fixing little continuity mistakes that I made because I'm really bad at that, and lots of like double checking my research and second guessing my research, and then realizing like, oh my gosh, I completely described this rope thing incorrectly, so I've got to go back in there and lots of that. So that was maybe another 6 months, and then the 6 months after that were just kind of this prior 6 months up to release, and then that's always a really scary part because it starts coming out in NetGalley and wherever else, ARCs, however else they're distributed. And that's always really nerve-wracking with like those first.
Yeah, because it's kind of set in stone at that point. Like there are final changes that, copy edits and things like that, but the story's kind of what the story's going to be at that point, right?
Yep, and I'm always terrified that I'm going to see some reaction that, oh, I didn't expect that, or I never thought of that, and it's going to be too late to change because it's all set in stone. So that's always the scariest part. But luckily, people seem to be really connecting with this one, so I'm like, okay, thank goodness.
Absolutely. I'm a huge advocate of having a writer friend to bounce ideas off of, especially in the beginning stages, because there's your ideas, and then there's your in this case your editor. There's her ideas, but something happens in the communication back and forth and the spitballing ideas, where it's more than what you could contribute or what she could contribute. I can't grab the word right now, but it becomes big. The sum is bigger than the parts.
Yeah.
It's magic, and a lot of people are terrified, especially in their earlier writing stages, that well, I don't want to give away my ideas, and well, let's just go ahead and dismiss that right now. That there are millions of ideas. That's yours are not necessarily special ideas, but it's then what you do with them, and having that relationship with someone that you can go back and forth and let the story build is critical. And can you kind of speak to what that does for you in your creative process?
Oh, I could not function without it. And I think and that's, both kind of in the front end when, my editor is kind of helping me shape the story. And that's also in the back end after I've written it and I've got beta readers looking at it. I get so locked into a story when I'm spending a year or longer writing it. I lose track of, I automatically think that everything I write sucks. So I'm always looking at it through that lens. Right. And I think part of it is I've become numb to the things about it that I like because I've been working on it so long, but the things that I don't like, those are still very clear to me. And I know that there's that saying, like, missing the forest for the trees. You can be so locked in on the small details that you just sort of lose your perspective on the greater work and what the work needs to be as good as it can be. And that's where I really depend on fresh eyes to look at it and tell me, okay, this worked, this didn't work. Focus your efforts here instead of focusing on this stupid tree that you've been obsessed with for a year.
Right. When you turn a book in and it's sent off to your editor, and it's going to be maybe a couple of months before you get edits back, what do you do at that time? I like to write short stories as ways to kind of cleanse the palate, fill in some time, explore ideas that kind of don't fit anywhere else. But what do you have things like that you do? Do you just completely walk away from the computer and say, I'm not thinking about writing at all until I get these edits back? Like what works good for you?
A little bit of everything. I'm actually in that time right now because I actually turned in my next book to my editor about 2 weeks ago, February 1st, a little over 2 weeks ago. And so I'm kind of in that lull period. And mostly I'm just thinking, okay, I need to think of something else. So I'm scraping together ideas for whatever my next project is going to be. But I do I've never tried short stories, but I think that would be a really good, because this is the point where I would really benefit from a palate cleanser because I've been so deep in one story and I'm about to jump back into it. This would be the point to do that.
Yeah. Try it and see how it works for you. Yeah. Tess and Allie, the main characters that we get to know in the book. I know you started with the setting first and then tried to find a relationship that would work in this confined space. But tell me about how these characters developed. Like when you kind of decided they're lifelong best friends. And so we kind of have some archetypes that you're going to work from. How did we go from the archetypes that you're going to stick in this cave to fully fleshed out characters?
I think that's another sort of fun thing. I'll be very careful about spoilers, but that's one of the fun things that the shape of the story allowed me to do is I can kind of present them. I lean into the archetypes a little bit early on to just kind of get the reader up to speed. Yeah. And then I start
I have a firm foundation you're standing on.
Yeah. And then I start twisting them a little or introducing new information that kind of changes everything. Because a lot of it is, kind of about a friendship being dismantled over the course of a 300-page book and buried things coming to light. And but I really like, I was kind of aware of those archetypes, the very shy person who never leaves their house, and then the
Right.
very outgoing person who just seems to have a charmed, glamorous life. She's a travel influencer. She, was in Iceland last week. She's doing all this cool stuff. And then the kind of resentment and jealousy that can build there. I wanted to start with really familiar elements and then start subverting them a little bit as the story goes on and on.
Yeah. Do you have rules? Or rules is a strong word, but do you have things that you rely on for when you do start subverting those tropes and these familiar elements? Um, do, do you set guardrails? That keep you from going too far, or do you think about that at all, or do you just think this is a great character? Let me twist, the knife on
I
him a little more.
A little bit. I think the big guardrail I had, because the story keeps changing points of view, and that's kind of, that's already, you're playing with fire a little bit when you're making such dramatic shifts in POV, that there was always somebody to root for. And even when we're in the villain's point of view,
Right.
we're seeing the hero through the villain's eyes, but obviously we're rooting for the hero. It's just we're in the headspace of the character who's doing the bad stuff and who we're not rooting for. And as the characters change through the ordeal, I think the biggest guardrail was there always has to be a hero somewhere. Even if we're not with the hero currently, like, the hero has to be present, so it's not just awful people doing awful things to each other in a cave. I wanted to avoid that.
Right. One thing I wanted to ask you when I was kind of looking back over your back catalog, I was preparing for this show, um, titles for your books. Uh, some authors have a title from the very beginning, and it kind of affects the shape of the book. Some people have a working title, or sometimes no title at all, and then it kind of reveals itself in the writing. With your when writing thriller and suspense, uh, the title can you have to be careful because it can give away a major plot point. It can but it can also lead the reader to think a certain way when in actuality you're over, behind the curtain pulling levers to subvert everything that they ever think about it. Um, how do you think about titles, and how does that work for you? Do you, come with a set in stone? Is it something you and your editor work on, or does it just not matter to you?
Titles scare the heck out of me. I've always found titles to be so hard to come
Yes.
up with, and it
Yes.
feels so high stakes because, like you said, you can really kneecap yourself right out of the
Yeah.
gate with a bad title, or a title that's been,
100%.
shared with too many other books. So you're just kind of white noise. Um, it's most of the time, it's always been, we've always had to work for titles, and my editor has always been, actually my editor was the one who came up with Her Last Breath for this book, because I think originally, when I first submitted it, it was called A Hard Place, like the saying, between a rock and a hard place. Not a great title, not as cute as I thought it was at the moment. And I think even back then I was like, we need to think of something better because this is not good enough. And then for a little while,
But it served as a working title, did it?
exactly. And
Yeah.
I think maybe that's like you have to write it first badly before you can write it better
Right.
later.
Sure.
It was Daylight for a little while, but then I found out that was a Sylvester Stallone movie from the 90s. And it was also sounded a little too happy for the book. So we're like, okay, let's try something else. And then it was The Devil's Staircase for a while, because that's the name of the fictional cave system. But then that created confusion, to your point, because I think when people hear the devil in a book, they think it's going to be a supernatural, like a ghost story type book,
True.
which
True.
That's creating an expectation that this book is not gonna match. And then Her Last Breath, I think one of the things my editor does is when she's reading a manuscript, she'll look for little phrases, and then she'll pull that as a title. And that's I think actually a really smart way to do it, because that was I believe where she got Her Last Breath, and that's just a perfect title for the book. And it was actually pretty late. I can't remember when we solidified the title, but it was later than I would have liked. Like we were down to the wire on that one. I think it
It's so
wasn't.
funny, but because when I started reading it, I had in the back of my mind Her Last Breath. So I'm immediately scouring, trying to figure out, well, which her are we talking about? Who's gonna, who's running out of breath? And after I don't know 50 pages or so, I filed that away, and then by the time I got to the end of the book, I was like, oh.
There it is.
I won't give away, but yeah, it's perfect. So Taylor, you said you've turned in book number 5?
I have.
Yeah.
I just turned it in February 1st, and I'm really excited about it. I hope, fingers crossed that she likes it too. And yeah, we'll be starting the editing process pretty soon on that.
Can you tell us anything
I
about?
think I probably can. So this one is set in Iceland. So this is the first time I've written a book set outside of my home country.
Right.
And I'm still kind of like figuring out the best way to pitch the hook of this one, but it's basically about a married couple who are they've rented a car and they're driving through Iceland, these great big expanses of nothing, and they stop to help 2 other tourists who say they've been in a car accident and need a ride. And really quickly they start to suspect that these people are actually lying and not who they say they are. And it's a little bit of a twist on the hitchhiker formula, which I'd always thought that was a fun thing to explore.
Yeah. Well, since your hallmark is kind of putting people in situations and squeezing them, does Iceland provide one of these backdrops that you have open expanse, but it's actually kind of the nothingness is kind of ramping up the tension and squeezing them?
Yeah, in a way, and it's also structured a little more like a chase thriller than I've never really done a book that's a proper chase. So that was fun structurally because you have to think a little differently about how you're using the story spaces. So if I've done it right, there's still a lot of claustrophobia because a lot of this book takes place inside a moving car, but the destination is important, and what's behind them is important, and the amount of time they have to do this thing is important, and so I can hopefully get all these other pressures while still opening up the scope to, having multiple locations, which is kind of rare for me in a book.
I love it. I love it. Well, Her Last Breath is available everywhere now. Go grab it at your favorite local bookstore. If you don't have a great local bookstore, we'll put links to it in the show notes where you can grab it from Amazon or Audible. Taylor, tell people where they can find you online if they want to dig into your back catalog and, stay tuned for news coming up and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, which is tayloradamsauthor.com. You can also find me on social media. I'm not great at social media. I'm getting better. I'm learning. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I think I'm most active on Instagram because Instagram is the one that I've figured out the most.
And that tends to be where the good vibes are,
Yeah, Instagram is pretty fun.
Yeah, Facebook can be a bit of a dumpster fire from time to time, depending on which corner of Facebook that you get into. So,
yeah.
Perfect. We'll link those up as well. Taylor, always fun to chat. We're going to send everyone to pick up Her Last Breath, and good luck, buddy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on your show.